Caitlin Clark's run with Team USA in Puerto Rico did more than add another trophy to her name. It forced a conversation that a lot of people in women's basketball have been trying to avoid for a long time. Because once you watched what happened in that tournament, once you saw how cleanly the game was called, how freely the offense moved, and how quickly Clark took control, it became a lot harder to pretend that everything we've been watching around her in the WNBA was just normal basketball noise. That is really where this starts. Clark came into the FIBA Women's World Cup qualifying tournament after a long stretch away from competitive basketball. Most players in that situation are expected to be rusty. They are expected to look a step slow, a little cautious, a little unsure of timing. That is usually how it goes. Even elite players need a few games to settle into the speed of live action again. Clark stepped into her first senior national team tournament and immediately looked like the player everyone had been waiting to see. She did not play like someone trying to find herself again. She played like someone who knew exactly who she was the entire time and was just waiting to get the ball back in her hands. In her debut, she came off the bench and still completely changed the feel of the game. The numbers from that first performance against Senegal were ridiculous on their own. 17 points, 12 assists, and total control in just 19 minutes. But the real story was how she got those numbers. She was reading pressure before it could trap her, getting the ball ahead before defenses had time to recover, and turning broken defensive moments into easy points for everybody else. The offense looked different the minute she stepped in. It looked more dangerous, more alive, more unpredictable. That is what great playmakers do. They do not just put up nice box score lines. They change the emotional temperature of a game. And here is where the officiating conversation becomes impossible to ignore. In Puerto Rico, the whistles came. Not in some outrageous, superstar treatment kind of way. Not because officials were trying to hand Clark anything. They just called the fouls that were actually fouls. Reaches got called. Contact on handlers got called. Illegal physicality got called. Basic rulebook stuff. That is what made the difference feel so glaring. Nobody was gifting her points. The refs simply were not letting defenders turn every possession into a wrestling match. And once that happened, Clark's game opened up in a way that should make every WNBA official stop and think. Because this is the same player who spent 2 years in the WNBA dealing with a very different reality. Everybody has seen the clips by now. The hard body contact away from a ball, the grabs on catches, the hits on drives, the off-ball bumps that never seem to get the same whistle when she is the one taking them. It became so normal that people started treating it like part of the experience. Like this was just what happens when a big-name rookie enters a league and has to learn what pro basketball feels like. But Puerto Rico showed another version of the truth. When the game is simply called straight, when defenders are not allowed to constantly maul her without consequence, Clark does not just survive, she takes over. That is why her tournament felt like more than a comeback. It felt like evidence. She finished the event with 32 assists, led Team USA in assists per game, and ended up winning the tournament MVP. FIBA gave her that award because the impact was obvious. She was not just flashy. She was the engine. Team USA looked better when she was directing traffic. The pace improved, the spacing made more sense, and teammates got cleaner scoring chances because her reads came so early. That is not a coincidence. That is not hype. That is basketball. And the thing that makes this even more revealing is that she was not handed the keys from the start. The early approach with Team USA felt cautious. The ball was shared. The structure was more balanced. And Clark was not immediately positioned as the full-time offensive centerpiece. Then came the reminders. Every time she got extended minutes, the offense looked sharper. Every time the ball moved through her naturally, the whole team seemed to breathe easier. Once the lineup became more guard-heavy and more aligned with what she does best, Team USA became much harder to handle. The wins got easier. The rhythm got cleaner. The game started looking the way it probably should have looked from the start. That is why so many fans walked away from Puerto Rico feeling vindicated. They had spent 2 seasons being told not to overreact. They had spent 2 seasons hearing that Clark just needed time, that the WNBA physicality was normal, that the officiating complaints were exaggerated, that stars always deal with rough treatment, and that the game was being called the same for everyone. Then Clark gets on a FIBA floor, under a different officiating standard, and suddenly the same player looks impossible to contain without actually playing real basketball against her. That changes the conversation. It does not settle every debate forever, but it absolutely blows a hole in the idea that everything around her in the WNBA has been fair and ordinary, and that is where the commissioner's past comments become harder to defend. When people raise serious concerns about the quality and consistency of WNBA officiating, the response from leadership sounded soft. Officials are human. Everyone complains about refs. It is a familiar answer, but it starts feeling weak when there are multiple examples on tape of the same player taking the same kinds of hits with no call. One bad miss happens. Two bad misses happen. But when the pattern keeps stacking and then disappears the moment the player steps into an international setting with a tighter whistle, you cannot just shrug and act like there is nothing to investigate. This is not even really about special treatment. That is the part people keep getting wrong. Nobody serious is asking for Clark to get a superstar whistle where every touch becomes a foul. The point is much simpler. Call the obvious contact. Call the stuff that is already in the rule book. Call the hand checks, the grabs, the bumps, and the off-ball hits the same way no matter who's on the floor. Because when that happens, Clark's talent becomes much harder to disguise. Puerto Rico showed that clearly. FIBA refs did not elevate her. They just stopped taking away the normal protections that elite offensive players are supposed to have. There's another layer to this, too, and it has to do with how Clark handled it. Because while other people were making the tournament about officiating, body language, or whether she should shine too brightly, Clark kept bringing the focus back to basketball. She talked about being happy to be back on the court. She talked about how much she missed just getting sweaty and playing again. She talked about team execution and improvement. That is part of why her rise continues to hit so hard. She is not carrying herself like someone begging the world to notice how unfair things have been. She is carrying herself like someone who trusts that, eventually, the game will expose the truth on its own. And in Puerto Rico, it did. She ended the tournament as the youngest MVP in the history of this qualifying event. She led the entire field in assists, plus minus, and efficiency. She wore number 12 for Team USA. The number tied so closely to Diana Taurasi's international legacy, and then got Taurasi's public blessing afterward. That symbolism mattered. When one of the most decorated players in the history of USA basketball says she cannot think of anyone better to carry that number forward, that is not some empty compliment. That is recognition. That is one great player watching another and understanding exactly what is happening. The best part is that Puerto Rico did not just matter for Team USA. It mattered for Indiana too. Fever fans should have watched that tournament and seen a blueprint, not some fantasy version of Clark's game, but a very real, very practical example of what happens when the offense is built around her actual strengths. Push the pace. Let her make the first read. Spread the floor. Trust her vision. Let the defense react instead of letting it get comfortable. Once Team USA leaned into that, everything looked simpler. The same lesson applies in Indiana. If the Fever embrace that version of their offense completely, they are going to be a real problem because the roster is not weak. Aaliyah Boston gives them interior skill and presence. Kelsey Mitchell is still one of the most dangerous scorers in the league. Lexi Hull brings effort and defensive activity. Sophie Cunningham adds shooting and edge. That group does not need Clark to be something she is not. It needs her to be exactly what she already is. The pace setter, the connector, the playmaker who sees the next play before the defense knows it is happening. Puerto Rico showed what that looks like with Team USA talent around her. Fever fans should be thrilled by what that suggests for 2026. And then there's the biggest question of all. If Clark is officiated fairly in the WNBA, what does that mean for the MVP race? That is the part this tournament really throws into the spotlight. Because if a more consistently whistled game unlocks this version of Clark, then the league may have a much bigger problem on its hands than just angry fans criticizing refs. It may have to deal with the fact that one of the most watched, most marketable, and most naturally gifted offensive players the women's game has ever seen has not even been playing in the cleanest possible version of her environment yet. If Puerto Rico was a preview of that, then the rest of the league should be paying attention right now. This is why the numbers from the tournament matter so much. Not because every single record claim floating online needs to be repeated dramatically, but because the core truth behind them is undeniable. Clark was historically productive in Puerto Rico. She dominated her debut. She ran the offense at a level nobody else in the tournament matched. She won MVP. And she did all of it in a setting where the game was officiated in a way that looked far more functional and far less chaotic than what WNBA fans have grown used to seeing around her. That is a real storyline. That is a meaningful development. And that is the kind of thing that should make people uncomfortable if they have spent the last 2 years dismissing concerns about how she has been treated. The funniest part is that none of this required some grand speech from Clark. She did not need to campaign. She did not need to call anybody out. She did not need to walk into press conferences demanding respect. She just played. She came back from a long layoff, stepped into senior international basketball, and made the game look easy enough that everyone else had to start explaining what they were seeing. That is always more powerful than complaining. Let the tape talk. Let the numbers talk. Let the offense talk. Clark has become very good at doing exactly that. So now the pressure shifts. It shifts back onto the WNBA. It shifts back onto the officials. It shifts back onto everybody who insisted there was no real issue here, that fans were exaggerating, that missed calls were random, and that Clark just needed to handle the game as it was being called. Puerto Rico gave everyone a comparison point. That is the key. We now have a recent, high-level international sample of what Caitlin Clark looks like when the game is called tighter and cleaner around her. And that version of Clark is terrifying. If the league handles that honestly, the 2026 season could be huge, not just for Clark individually, but for the fever, for the MVP race, and for women's basketball as a whole. Because when a player with this kind of vision, range, and playmaking gets a fair shot to operate, it elevates everything. The scoring gets easier, the passing gets sharper, the product gets better, the audience grows. Puerto Rico did not just give Clark another accolade. It gave the sport a very clear picture of what is possible when the game around her is allowed to function properly. And that is why this tournament will stick with people. Not because of one flashy stat or one hot take, but because it answered a question that had been hanging over the sport. What happens when Caitlin Clark gets a more fairly officiated environment and the chance to run an offense without constant uncalled chaos around her? The answer is simple. She becomes even more dangerous than her biggest supporters already believed.